The Mafia boss sat in the back seat as his car crawled through traffic. Tinted windows, engine humming. Another street he usually ignored. Then he saw her. A little girl, no more than 6, kneeling beside a trash bin. Bare hands, torn shoes, carefully pulling bottles from the garbage and wiping them clean on her sleeve. "Slow down," he said quietly. Across the sidewalk, a woman waited, thin, exhausted, holding a sack already half full. The girl ran back to her, smiling like she'd found treasure. "Good job, baby," the woman whispered, kissing her forehead. Something tightened in the boss's chest, an irritation, a memory he didn't want. Then the girl laughed. The sound cut through him. That laugh. He'd heard it before, years ago, in a hospital room he was never supposed to leave. The girl suddenly looked up, straight at the black car. For a heartbeat, the city disappeared. Same eyes, same dimple on the left cheek, same way she tilted her head when she was curious. The boss's hand froze on the door handle, because the last time he'd seen a child with that face, a doctor had told him she didn't survive. And yet here she was, digging through trash, smiling at her mother, alive. Stay with me until the end, because the truth about that little girl will tear open a past the Mafia boss believed was buried forever. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video, hit subscribe, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's get started. Marco Santangelo controlled half the city from the shadows. At 52, he had built an empire that stretched across 3 states. Money flowed through his hands like water. Politicians answered his calls. Enemies disappeared without a trace. His word was absolute law in the criminal underworld. But none of that prepared him for seeing a ghost on a Tuesday afternoon. The little girl with the bottles couldn't be more than 6 years old. Her dark hair hung in tangled waves around a face that belonged to someone else entirely. Someone who had died 7 years ago in a hospital bed, while Marco held her hand and whispered promises he couldn't keep. His driver, Tommy, glanced in the rearview mirror. "Boss, you okay back there?" Marco's fingers gripped the leather seat until his knuckles went white. The child across the street was methodically checking each bottle for cracks before placing it carefully in her mother's sack. Her movements were precise, deliberate, just like Isabella used to arrange her toys in perfect little rows. Isabella, his daughter, the only person who had ever made Marco Santangelo believe in something beyond power and fear. 7 years had passed since the cancer took her. 7 years since he'd buried a tiny casket and sworn never to feel that kind of pain again. The doctors had been certain, terminal, no hope. He'd watched his little girl fade away despite every specialist money could buy, every experimental treatment, every desperate prayer to a God he'd stopped believing in decades earlier. Yet here was this child, moving exactly like Isabella, laughing exactly like Isabella, looking exactly like the daughter he'd lost. Marco's phone buzzed. Business never stopped, even when the world tilted sideways. "Yeah, boss, we got that meeting with the Colombians in 20 minutes. His Lieutenant Carlo's voice crackled through the speaker. "You want us to cancel it?" "Cancel it? Boss, this deal's been months in the making. They flew in from Miami just for—" "I said cancel it." Marco's voice carried the kind of steel that ended conversations. "Tell them something came up." He ended the call and leaned forward. "Tommy, park the car. Here? Now." The black sedan pulled to the curb 50 feet from where the woman and child continued their work. Marco studied them through the tinted glass. The woman looked to be in her early 30s, with the kind of weariness that came from too many sleepless nights and not enough meals. Her clothes were clean but worn thin from washing. She moved like someone accustomed to being invisible, to avoiding attention. But it was the child who held Marco's focus. Every gesture sparked a memory he'd tried to bury. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when concentrating. How she bit her lower lip when examining something closely. The careful way she handed each bottle to her mother, as if presenting a precious gift. Isabella used to do the same thing with the flowers she'd pick from the hospital garden during her treatments. Each dandelion or half-wilted rose was offered with such ceremony, such pride in her small contribution. Marco's chest tightened. He'd trained himself not to think about those moments. They belonged to a different man, a softer version of himself that had died alongside his daughter. The Marco Santangelo who existed now had no room for sentiment, no tolerance for weakness. But this child was making him remember everything. The woman said something to the girl, who nodded and scampered toward another trash bin further down the street. Her little legs carried her with determined purpose, and Marco found himself holding his breath as she navigated around a broken piece of sidewalk that could have tripped her, just like Isabella used to do when she'd insist on walking to the hospital cafeteria by herself, despite the IV pole she had to drag along. "Boss," Tommy's voice was uncertain. "You want me to run the plates on anyone? Check if these people are connected to something?" Marco almost laughed. Connected to something. If only Tommy knew how right he was, though not in any way that made sense in their world of territories and vendettas. "No," Marco said quietly. "Just watch." The girl had found something interesting in the second trash bin. She held up what looked like a small toy car, missing one wheel but otherwise intact. Her face lit up with the kind of joy most adults had forgotten how to feel. She examined the car from every angle, then carefully cleaned it with the edge of her shirt before tucking it into her pocket. Isabella had done the same thing with a broken music box another patient had thrown away. She'd spent hours trying to fix the tiny ballerina inside, convinced she could make it dance again if she just found the right way to wind the spring. The memory hit Marco like a physical blow. Isabella sitting cross-legged on her hospital bed, tongue poking out in concentration as she worked on that music box. She'd never gotten it to work properly, but she'd treasured it anyway, keeping it on her nightstand until the very end. Marco's phone rang again. This time it was his wife, Elena. He almost didn't answer. "Marco? Carlo said you canceled the Colombian meeting. Is everything all right?" Elena. Beautiful, cold Elena, who had married him for his money and stayed for his protection. She'd been appropriately sad when Isabella died, had played the grieving stepmother with perfect precision at the funeral. But she'd also been quietly relieved when the reminders of Marco's previous life disappeared from their house. "I'm fine," Marco said, not taking his eyes off the child. Something came up. "Will you be home for dinner? I made reservations at that new place downtown." Home. Their sprawling mansion in the hills, filled with expensive art and empty rooms. A house that had never heard a child's laughter echo through its halls since Isabella died. "I don't know." Elena's sigh was audible through the phone. "Marco, you've been different lately. Distant. If something's bothering you..." I said I'm fine. His tone ended the conversation. Elena hung up without another word. The girl was walking back toward her mother now, the toy car visible in her small hand. As she approached, she suddenly stumbled on an uneven piece of pavement. Marco's heart lurched as she went down hard on her knees, the toy car skittering across the sidewalk. Without thinking, Marco opened the car door. "Boss, what are you..." But Marco was already out, his expensive shoes hitting the cracked sidewalk as he moved toward the fallen child. She was sitting up, examining a scraped knee that was starting to bleed. Tears threatened at the corners of her eyes, but she was fighting them back with the kind of stubborn courage that made Marco's throat close up. Isabella had been the same way, never wanting to cry in front of the doctors, always trying to be brave for everyone else. Marco knelt down beside the girl, his shadow falling across her small form. This close, the resemblance was even more striking. Not just the physical features, but something deeper, an expression, a way of holding herself that was achingly familiar. "You okay, sweetheart?" His voice came out rougher than he intended. The girl looked up at him with wide, dark eyes, eyes exactly like Isabella's. For a moment, neither of them moved. Marco felt like he was looking into the past, into a future that had been stolen from him 7 years ago. "I'm okay," she whispered, her voice small but steady. "I just need to find my car." Marco glanced around and spotted the toy where it had rolled against a fire hydrant. He retrieved it and held it out to her. "This what you're looking for?" Her face transformed with relief and gratitude. "Thank you, mister. I thought it was broken, but look." She held up the toy car, and Marco saw that the missing wheel had been crudely replaced with what looked like a button. "Mama helped me fix it last night." The simple pride in her voice nearly undid him. Isabella used to sound exactly the same when she'd accomplished something she was proud of. "My mama says when you help someone, it comes back to you." The girl continued, carefully examining her scraped knee. "So maybe that's why you found my car." Marco stared at her, this impossible child with Isabella's voice speaking words his daughter might have said. The rational part of his mind knew this was coincidence. Resemblance. Nothing more than cruel chance playing tricks on a grieving father's heart. But then the girl did something that stopped his world completely. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, worn photograph. The edges were frayed from being handled countless times, and she held it like it contained her most precious secret. "This is my real daddy," she whispered, glancing around to make sure her mother couldn't hear. "Mama doesn't like me to talk about him, but I keep his picture anyway." Marco's blood turned to ice as she held up the photograph. Staring back at him was his own face. Younger, happier. The version of himself that had existed when Isabella was alive. It was a picture he remembered being taken at a hospital fundraiser, one of the few public events he'd attended for Isabella's sake. The world tilted. Sound disappeared. Everything except this impossible moment ceased to exist. "Where did you get that?" His voice barely qualified as a whisper. The girl's eyes went wide, suddenly uncertain. She clutched the photo closer to her chest, as if she'd revealed too much. "I'm sorry, mister. I shouldn't have shown you. Mama says it makes people uncomfortable when I talk about him." But Marco wasn't listening to her words anymore. His mind was racing backward through time, through memories he'd buried so deep, he'd convinced himself they were gone forever. 7 years ago, the night before Isabella died, she'd been sleeping more and more, the cancer stealing her strength one breath at a time. But that night, she'd been awake, alert, almost peaceful in a way that should have warned him. "Daddy," she'd whispered, her small hand finding his across the hospital bed. "I need to tell you something important." He'd leaned closer, desperate for any words she wanted to share. Time was running out, and he knew it. They both knew it. "There's another little girl," Isabella had said, her voice so quiet he'd almost missed it. "She looks just like me, and she needs you to find her." Marco had thought it was the morphine talking, the fevered imagination of a dying child grasping for meaning in her final hours. He'd kissed her forehead and promised to listen, the way parents do when their children tell them about imaginary friends or impossible dreams. Isabella had smiled then, that radiant smile that could light up the darkest room. "She's real, Daddy, and someday you're going to save her just like you tried to save me." Those were among the last coherent words his daughter ever spoke. By morning, she was gone, and Marco had buried that conversation along with everything else that hurt too much to remember. But now, staring at this child with Isabella's face and his own photograph clutched in her tiny hands, those words came flooding back with crushing clarity. "What's your name, sweetheart?" Marco asked, his voice steadier than he felt. "Sophia," she replied, still watching him with cautious curiosity. "Sophia Martinez." Martinez. The name hit him like a physical blow. He knew that name, not from his criminal enterprises or business dealings, but from a different life entirely. A life he'd tried to forget. 7 years ago, before Isabella got sick, Marco had been different. Still dangerous, still powerful, but not yet the cold, emotionless machine he'd become. He'd had weaknesses then, vulnerabilities, including a brief relationship with a nurse named Carmen Martinez, who'd worked at Isabella's hospital. Carmen had been kind to Isabella during those early treatments, when they'd still believed the cancer was treatable. She'd brought extra blankets, stayed late to read stories, made a scared little girl feel less alone in a place that smelled of disinfectant and despair. Marco had been grateful, more than grateful, For a few months, Carmen had made him feel like there might be light somewhere beyond the darkness that was swallowing his daughter. But when Isabella's condition worsened, when the treatments became more desperate and the hope more fragile, Marco had ended things with Carmen. He'd convinced himself it was for her own good, that she deserved better than a man whose world was crumbling. He'd also been terrified that caring about someone else would somehow take away from the love and attention Isabella needed. Carmen had been understanding, professional. She'd continued caring for Isabella without letting their personal history interfere. And when Isabella died, Carmen had been one of the few people at the funeral whose tears seemed genuinely meant for the little girl they'd lost, not for the powerful man who'd suffered a tragedy. But Marco had never known Carmen was pregnant. The realization crashed over him like a tidal wave. The timing was right. The resemblance was impossible to ignore. And this child, this little girl picking bottles from trash bins to help her struggling mother, was carrying his photograph like a talisman. "Sophia," he said carefully, testing the name on his tongue. "Do you know why your mama has that picture?" Sophia glanced toward where her mother was still working, making sure they had privacy for this conversation. "She told me my daddy was a very important man who had to go away before I was born. She said he didn't know about me, but that maybe someday we'd find each other." Marco's chest tightened until he could barely breathe. Carmen had never told him, had never reached out, never demanded support or acknowledgement. She'd raised this child alone, working as a nurse until something had clearly gone wrong. Now she was on the streets, collecting bottles with her daughter, struggling to survive, and he'd never known he had another child. "Sophia," Carmen's voice called from across the street. "Come back here, baby. We need to finish before it gets dark." Sophia jumped to her feet, carefully tucking the photograph back into her pocket. "I have to go. Thank you for helping me find my car, mister." She started to run back toward her mother, then stopped and turned around. "What's your name?" Marco stared at this child who was his daughter, this impossible gift he'd never known existed. "Marco," he said quietly. "My name is Marco." Sophia's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment she looked like she might say something else. But then Carmen called again, more urgently this time, and the spell was broken. Marco watched as Sophia ran back to her mother, who immediately began examining the scraped knee with the practiced concern of someone accustomed to treating injuries. Carmen's hands moved with the gentle efficiency of a trained nurse, and even from a distance, Marco could see the love and devotion in every gesture. This woman had raised his daughter alone for 6 years, had somehow kept Isabella's memory alive through a photograph, had instilled in Sophia the same kindness and courage that had made Isabella special. Carmen had done everything right, and he'd done nothing at all. Because he hadn't known, but now he did. And Marco Santangelo had built an empire by never walking away from something that belonged to him. Tommy's voice drifted from the still open car door. "Boss? Everything okay?" Marco didn't answer immediately. He was watching Carmen and Sophia work together. This little family that should have been his family, reduced to scavenging in the streets while he lived in luxury, bought with blood and fear. Something fundamental was shifting inside him. The walls he'd built after Isabella's death, the emotional barriers that had made him untouchable and unfeeling, were cracking, not breaking entirely, not yet, but developing fissures that let in dangerous things like hope and responsibility and love. "Tommy," Marco said finally, his voice carrying a new kind of determination. "I want you to follow them, discreetly. Find out where they live, what their situation is, everything. You want me to run a full background check? I want you to find out how my daughter ended up homeless." The words hung in the air between them like a confession. Tommy's eyes widened in the rearview mirror, but he was smart enough not to ask questions. In their world, information was power, and power was survival. Marco climbed back into the car, but his eyes never left Sophia and Carmen as they moved down the street. His daughter, his child, alive and struggling and completely unaware that her father commanded an empire that could give her everything she'd ever need. The question wasn't whether he would help them. That decision had been made the moment Sophia showed him that photograph. The moment he understood that Isabella's dying words hadn't been fever dreams, but somehow, impossibly, prophetic truth. The question was, how much of his world he was willing to tear apart to make things right. Because bringing Sophia and Carmen into his life wouldn't just mean gaining a family. It would mean exposing them to enemies who wouldn't hesitate to use an innocent child as leverage against him. It would mean risking everything he'd built to protect people who didn't even know they needed protecting. But as Marco watched his daughter carefully place another bottle in her mother's sack, her small face bright with pride at contributing to their survival, he realized something that changed everything. He'd already lost one daughter to forces beyond his control. He wasn't going to lose this one to forces within it. The next morning, Marco sat in his office overlooking the city skyline, coffee growing cold on his mahogany desk, reports from his lieutenants scattered across expensive leather, numbers that represented power, territory, millions of dollars in revenue. None of it mattered. Tommy's report lay open in front of him. 3 pages that painted a picture of survival that made Marco's jaw clench with each detail. Carmen Martinez, former registered nurse at St. Mary's Hospital, unemployed for 8 months after budget cuts eliminated her position. Evicted from their apartment 6 weeks ago. Currently staying at the Riverside Women's Shelter with Sophia. The shelter had a waiting list for families. Carmen and Sophia were sleeping in their car 3 nights a week. Marco's daughter was homeless. His phone buzzed. Elena's name appeared on the screen. He declined the call, then declined it again when she called back immediately. The office door opened without a knock. Only one person in his organization had that privilege. Boss, Vincent Torino, stepped inside, closing the door behind him. Marco's oldest friend and most trusted advisor. The only man alive who remembered what Marco had been like before. Power consumed everything soft in him. "You look like hell," Vincent said, settling into the chair across from Marco's desk. "Didn't sleep. The Colombian deal. Word's getting around that you walked away from $8 million yesterday. People are asking questions." Marco pushed the report across his desk. Vincent read it in silence, his expression growing more troubled with each line. "Jesus Christ," Vincent whispered. "This is the nurse from Isabella's hospital. The one you—" "Yes. And you think the kid is yours?" Marco pulled out his phone. Tommy had managed to take several photos from a distance. Sophia playing in the shelter's small courtyard. Sophia helping her mother carry their few possessions in garbage bags. Sophia sharing half her sandwich with another homeless child. Vincent stared at the images. "She looks exactly like Isabella. Exactly. Have you talked to Carmen? Confirmed anything?" "Not yet." Vincent set the phone down carefully. "Marco, if this is true, if this child is really yours, bringing her into your world could get her killed. You know that, right?" Marco had spent the entire night thinking about exactly that. Every enemy he'd made, every rival who would see Sophia as the perfect weapon against him, every choice he'd made that had painted targets on everything he cared about. "I know. So what are you going to do?" Marco stood and walked to the window. Below, the city sprawled in all directions. His city. Territory he'd claimed through violence and maintained through fear. A kingdom built on the graves of men who'd underestimated him. But somewhere out there, his 6-year-old daughter was eating donated food and sleeping on a cot in a shelter because the father she'd never met was too dangerous to acknowledge her existence. "I'm going to fix this." Vincent's laugh was bitter. "Fix this? Marco, you can't just throw money at this and make it disappear. The moment you claim that child publicly, she becomes a target. Every psychopath with a grudge against you will see her as their ticket to revenge. Then I'll eliminate every psychopath with a grudge. There are hundreds of them, thousands. You'd have to go to war with half the families on the East Coast." Marco turned from the window. "Then that's what I'll do." Vincent studied his oldest friend's face. He'd seen that expression before. The same cold determination that had built their empire. The same ruthless focus that had destroyed anyone foolish enough to stand in their way. "You're serious?" Dead serious. This will change everything. Our alliances, our territories, the way we do business, everything we've built. Isabella died because I couldn't protect her from cancer. Sophia's suffering because I can't protect her from poverty. I failed both my daughters, but Sophia's still alive, which means I still have a chance to get this right. Vincent was quiet for a long moment. What do you need from me? Start with the Morettis. They've been pushing into our territory for months. Make an example. Send a message that anyone who thinks Marco Santangelo is getting soft will learn otherwise. And Carmen, the mother? Marco returned to his desk. I'm going to see her today. Alone. That's not smart. Meeting without backup, without... Vincent. Marco's voice carried enough steel to stop the objection. This isn't a business negotiation. This is me talking to the mother of my child. A mother who's been raising that child alone for 6 years. She might not want your help. She might not trust you. Hell, she might not even believe you care. Marco considered this. Carmen had every right to hate him. He'd walked away from their relationship when she'd needed him most, had left her to face pregnancy and motherhood alone while he'd grieved his dying daughter. She could have reached out, could have told him about Sophia, but she'd chosen to handle everything herself. Pride, independence, the same qualities that had drawn him to her in the first place. Then I'll convince her. Vincent shook his head. And if she says no? If she tells you to stay away from both of them? She won't. How can you be so sure? Marco picked up one of Tommy's photographs. Sophia sitting on the shelter steps, carefully mending a tear in her only stuffed animal with thread she'd found somewhere. Her face was serious, concentrated, determined to fix what was broken despite having so little to work with. Because she's raising my daughter in a homeless shelter, and I'm offering her a palace. She's not stupid. She's also not greedy. If she were, she would have contacted you years ago. Money might not be enough. Marco set the photo down. Then I'll offer her something else. What? The truth. The Riverside Women's Shelter sat in a part of town Marco rarely visited. Not because it was dangerous. He owned most of the crime in this neighborhood, but because poverty made him uncomfortable in ways that violence never did. Violence was clean, predictable. You eliminated threats and moved forward. Poverty was messier, complicated, full of innocent people suffering through no fault of their own. Marco parked his black sedan across the street and studied the building. 3 stories of weathered brick and broken dreams. A line of women and children waited outside for the dinner service. Some clutched garbage bags containing their entire lives. Others held small children who didn't understand why they couldn't go home. He spotted Carmen immediately, still beautiful despite the exhaustion etched around her eyes. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, and she wore scrubs that had seen better days. She was helping an elderly woman navigate the shelter's front steps, her movements gentle and patient. Still a nurse, still taking care of people even when she had nothing left to give. Sophia appeared at Carmen's side, tugging on her mother's sleeve. Even from a distance, Marco could see the animated way his daughter was talking, her small hands gesturing as she told some story that made Carmen smile. That smile. Marco remembered that smile, the way it had brightened those terrible hospital corridors during Isabella's treatments, the way it had made him believe, for a brief moment, that good things could still happen to people like him. Marco crossed the street. Each step felt like walking toward a cliff edge. Once he spoke to Carmen, once he acknowledged what he suspected, there would be no going back. Sophia would become real in a way that changed everything. Carmen. She turned at the sound of his voice. Recognition flickered across her features, followed immediately by something that might have been fear. Her hand found Sophia's shoulder, pulling the child closer. Marco. Her voice was steady, but he could see the tension in her posture. What are you doing here? Sophia looked up at him with bright curiosity. Mama, this is the man who helped me yesterday. The one who found my toy car. Carmen's eyes widened slightly. You met. We need to talk. Marco's voice was quiet, but it carried across the space between them like a physical presence. Alone. Carmen glanced around at the other shelter residents, clearly aware that their conversation was drawing attention. Sofia, go inside and find Mrs. Rodriguez. Tell her I'll be there in a few minutes. But Mama, go. Sofia looked between her mother and Marco with the sharp intuition children possessed. Something important was happening. Something that involved her in ways she didn't understand. But she obeyed, disappearing through the shelter's front door after one last curious glance. Carmen waited until they were alone before speaking. How did you find us? Does it matter? It matters to me. We've been careful. We don't cause trouble, we keep to ourselves. Marco studied her face. The same Carmen, but harder now. Shaped by years of struggle he should have helped her avoid. Why didn't you tell me? Tell you what? About Sofia? Carmen's composure cracked slightly. I don't know what you... She has my photograph, Carmen. She calls me her daddy. She looks exactly like Isabella. Marco stepped closer, lowering his voice. Why didn't you tell me I had another daughter? Carmen was quiet for so long Marco wondered if she would answer at all. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. Because I was terrified you'd take her away from me. The admission hung between them like a confession. Marco understood then why Carmen had raised Sofia alone, why she'd chosen poverty over reaching out to a man who commanded armies and controlled territories. I would never, wouldn't you? Carmen's eyes flashed with old pain. You're Marco Santangelo. You take what you want. You eliminate what threatens you. What was I supposed to think? That you'd be content with visitation rights and birthday cards? Marco had no answer for that, because she was right. The man he'd become after Isabella's death might have done exactly what Carmen feared. Might have decided that a nurse with no money and no connections wasn't fit to raise the daughter of someone like him. Things are different now, are they? You still have the same enemies, the same dangerous life, the same world that destroys everything innocent that touches it. Marco looked at Carmen, this woman who had sacrificed everything to protect the daughter he never knew existed. The same woman who had shown kindness to Isabella in her final days, who had raised Sofia with the same gentle strength that made both his daughters extraordinary. You're right, he said quietly. My world destroys innocent things. But Sofia isn't just innocent. She's mine, and I protect what's mine. Carmen's eyes filled with tears she'd been holding back for 6 years. She asks about you every night, wonders if you'll ever come find her. Marco reached into his jacket and pulled out a business card. Not the usual kind with threats or demands, just an address. Tomorrow morning, bring Sofia. There's someone I want you both to meet. Who? The family that's going to make sure neither of you ever sleep in a shelter again. As Marco walked back to his car, he heard Sofia's laugh echoing from inside the shelter. The same laugh that had haunted him for 7 years. But this time, it wasn't a ghost from the past. It was a promise for the future. Sometimes the most powerful men in the world are brought to their knees by the smallest hands reaching out for help. And sometimes, just sometimes, those hands belong to the family they never knew they were searching for.